manager is the overall control panel for your drawing. We'll default almost all of our properties to the layer manager. So by default, the layers that are in here, if we need to make a change, we just need to make a change within the layer manager. We'll do that a lot as we start to build up our own drawing set. So let's talk about this layer manager in here. By default, typically you'll either have a 0, sometimes you'll have a def points layer as well. For the most part, we're going to not use either one of those, particularly the def points. I'm not totally sure why it's in there, but it just kind of is one of those layers that files tend to produce themselves. So up here, we're going to initially talk about these buttons here. We'll come back to layer states in a moment. But right now, we've only got one layer, which means by default, our drawing is on layer 0. If I go to this button right here, it's the one all the way to the left. It's got a little sun. If I hit this, I get a new layer. So it asks me to want to name that layer, and then also provides several options over here. So let's call this one, and we'll talk about layer naming standards in another lesson. Let's call this one L-curb. Very easy. We renamed our layer. So all you got to do is double click into here, highlight, change the name. Next layer, or next button over, on. Next one over, freeze, lock, plot, color, line type, line weight, transparency, new viewport freeze. We'll discuss this a little bit when we get into plotting, and description. I think you can add more to this list if you want. I'm not going to mess with any of that. So first thing we're actually going to change on here is we're going to change this. So left click on the color, the little square color, and I'm going to make it green. This green that's down here, color index color number 3. We'll talk about what all of these colors equate in another lesson, but I'm going to hit OK. That changes that to green. We're going to leave all of the rest of these as is for now, and I'm going to hit close. So right now, and I know we're covering this in another one, but if you left click, drag to the left, and select this, go back to our home tab, you can see this is on layer 0. If you highlight something, it'll change the layer up here. If I can also select this and click this drop down, and now I've got our other layer that we made. If I change this to L-curb, you can see the outline of this image change from white to green. So particularly for an XRF image, the border kind of tells you what layer it's on, or at least the color of the layer. We don't have anything currently selected. If you think you do have something selected, just hit escape a couple of times. It means you have nothing selected. Now, that means that layer 0 is our active layer. Whichever one we see up here, that's our active layer. If I drop on this, click down, and then click L-curb, L-curb is now our active layer. So if I draw something, PL for polyline, enter, I get a green line. Also, if I go to our layer properties, this little check on our status means that that's our active layer. So let's actually add one more. Let's call it L-wall, and change this to index color 4 or cyan. So I'm going to close that. L-curb is still active. I'm going to close that. Now, if I make L-wall our active layer, PL, enter, draw another line. This one's cyan. Again, whatever your active is and you draw, what color it's going to show up. That's what layer it's on. If I select something, hit the drop down, change it, that's going to change the color as well. The important part of this is that if I select all of these, all of this stays the same. All of this says by layer. I could select this line, click off of by layer, and just change the color. But if I select this, it still is on wall, L-wall. All that does, and we'll talk about this in another or a later lesson, is this will print either in a different color or in a different line weight, or both, because I changed one of its properties. So this is the line color property. You can still see this next one down is line weight. The one below it is line type. Both of those still say by layer. We want everything to always be by layer. So if I select all, change this back to by layer, this is changed back to L wall. That's what we want. All of our objects, all of our lines, everything we've got in model space to be by layer. Now the reason we do that is if I go to print and I realize, oh, you know what, all of my building walls are looking too bold, and I'll talk about how line color equates line weight later on. If I decided that my L walls were showing up too bold, I can simply come in, let's say, okay, I think I need to change them all to yellow. Now the two things that I had on L wall automatically updated to yellow because they're by layer. So all I had to do was change the layer properties and everything automatically updated. Once you get a really complex drawing with a lot of different layers, a lot of different objects, making one change in the layer manager to update everything automatically versus changing every individual line, you're saving a lot of time by doing that. So always by layer. Everything runs through the layer properties. To turn a layer off, I can do it a couple different ways. You've got a button down here. I can click that. Now, instead of the cursor or the crosshairs, I have a little square inside where my cursor should be. That's giving me a select indication. So if I select our L curve, click that, turned off. Let me hit Control Z for undo. That turned it back on. Let's actually draw a couple of things. So it's not just turning that object off. If I click the turn off button, click this. This is actually asking me if I want to turn this layer off because it's my current layer. I'm going to still hit yes. And now you can see the little light bulb is turned off. So I'll actually switch over to our L wall. Additionally, if I go into layer properties, it's now the light bulb's off, which means that layer is turned off. Now the difference between on, off, and freeze or unfrozen has to do with processing power. Ultimately, let's turn this back on. Ultimately, your machine probably won't have too much of an issue with it anymore. This was a way in the past that AutoCAD could save on processing. The technical way that this works is if I turn L curve off, AutoCAD is still processing that those lines are there even though they're turned off. If I freeze them, so here's the button for freeze. If I freeze them, it actually saves, because now it's kind of forgetting that those are there as far as processing power. Again, now the way our computers have advanced probably are not going to find this as a big difference. I actually use these more in an organizational way. We'll talk about that more once we have more items drawn. From a standpoint of what you can see, on, off, freeze, unfreeze, essentially the same. Let's turn that back on. Locking has to do, if I lock our L curve, you can see that it's dimmed a bit, and I can select it, but I can't do anything with it. If I try to move it, it won't let me move it. It's stuck in place. So the reason for doing that is you might accidentally move some lines sometimes, especially if you have a lot of complicated line work all together. So sometimes you'll find it's nice to lock some items. You can also lock here with this button. So now I'm clicking on and it locks the entire layer. So as you can see, even though one of these items are locked, the entire green set, our L curve layer, is frozen. To unlock, again, I can press this button, click here, can hit enter to do the command again, unlocks that layer. I can also do it through the layer manager window. The next section, plotting. This has to do with when we go to print. I'll touch on these a little bit more, but basically if you have one of these marked with this little, almost like a do not enter sign, that means you can see it, but it's not going to print. That's useful for construction lines or our non-plot layer, which we'll talk about. You just sort of use that for the lines to help you draw that you don't want to eventually see. Layer color, we will talk about this more in detail. But for now, the important thing is to remember we'll be almost exclusively using index colors. And from a drawing standpoint, red is our thinnest line and magenta is our largest line weight. That's all we really need to know for now. We'll talk about the specifics later. Line types. So line types become important when we have a lot of line work on our drawing. We'll mostly be drawing in continuous or solid lines, but if you click into one of these, we get our select line type, and then we actually need to load some lines. A lot of options here. You can also find additional ones online. We'll just stick with the default ones that AutoCAD allows. This is where you get different lines or line types. So for example, a center line is going to be a long line and a dash, long line, dash. That's a standard center line. Let's actually do this because we will need it. I'm going to do new layer. We'll call it L. PL stands for property line. I'm going to change our color to blue or index color 5. Hit OK. This line type, I know we will want to load Phantom X or Phantom 2. That's the one we're going to want to use. That is a line, 2 dashes, and a line. That's sort of a typical property line that you would see. And hit OK. Once you load it, you got to select it. So hit OK. That's changed to Phantom now. Now if I close this, I go to PL, property line. You won't necessarily see that line type. Well, I guess we got to zoom way in for this one. We'll talk about line type scale when we get to plotting, but you can see that this line, even though it has breaks in it, visually, it's all one line. So if I move it, I don't have to move each of those individual segments. It all, whoops, I zoomed in too far. They all move together. So it just represents this vector line as one line. Line weight, we are going to, in the way that I've been discussing, default everything to our layer properties, our layer manager, and specifically our colors within here. So we want all of these always set to default. That means that they are defaulting to our pen style, which we're going to talk about later, but that has to do with certain color equates a certain thickness of a line when you go to print. Transparency, we're going to leave these as 0. Changing the transparency on line work, every once in a while you need to do that. Realistically, you can accomplish most of that with changing your color from a black to a gray. Plotting tends to get caught up on this when you try to plot something with transparency. If you really need something to have a type of transparency to it and you can't accomplish that with your colors, I always do it in Photoshop. I find that is a lot easier and I have fewer problems.